All right, strap yourselves in because today we are going deep on a story that's, well, it's tragic, obviously, but also incredibly fascinating. Japan Airlines Flight 123, a Boeing 747 that crashed back in 1985, and it remains the deadliest single aircraft accident in history.
It's a tough one. Over 500 people were on board.
Yeah, and only four survived. And so today, what we're going to try to do is sort of unpack what were the events that led up to this disaster. Everything from decisions that were made years before the flight even took off to the harrowing moments right up to the crash.
Yeah, one thing that I think makes this event so compelling is that it wasn't just like one big catastrophic event.
Yeah.
It's this whole chain of events, human errors, maybe even a little bit of bad luck thrown in there, all culminating in this tragedy.
Yeah, and we're gonna break down sort of not just what happened, but also why it happened, because I think it highlights the importance of even the smallest details when it comes to aviation. But first, let's set the scene. It's August 12th, 1985. We have a Boeing 747 SR-46, registration JA8119, taking off from Tokyo's Haneda Airport, headed for Osaka. Seems like just a normal everyday flight, right?
Well, except for the fact that it was packed full of passengers, many of whom were headed home for the Obon holiday period, which, if you aren't familiar, is a time when families traditionally gather in Japan. So you've
Ah.
got over 500 people on this plane, mostly Japanese citizens,
hmm
but there were also people from 8 other countries.
Wow, it's almost unsettling to think about like all the individual stories of the people on this flight. We know, for instance, that the famous singer Hugh Sakamoto was on board, and then there were also a few celebrities who were like this close to getting on this flight, but then at the last minute changed their plans. Can you imagine how they felt looking back on that?
Oh yeah, that would give me chills. It really makes you think about fate and everything.
Totally.
But the story actually starts 7 years earlier in 1978 with this very same plane, JA8119. It was involved in a tail strike incident.
Tail straight.
Yeah, during landing. The tail of the plane scraped the runway.
Okay, so this tail strike we know ended up damaging what's called the aft pressure bulkhead, and I think for a lot of people they might not really know what that is. Can you sort of explain what the bulkhead does?
Sure, it's a pretty critical part of the plane's structure. You can think of it like a wall that separates the pressurized cabin
Hmm.
from the unpressurized tail section. And it's essential for, you know, maintaining the right cabin pressure during flight.
Okay, got it. So they repaired this bulkhead, but here's where things get a little bit,
Messy.
yeah, messy. The Boeing technicians who did the repair, they didn't exactly follow the proper guidelines.
Nope.
Instead of using one continuous plate to reinforce the damaged area, they used two splice plates. And I think, to somebody like me, I'm thinking, well, does that really make a difference? Is it really a big deal?
It is. And in this case, it was a very big deal.
So what happened?
Well, by using two splice plates instead of that one continuous plate, like Boeing's guidelines specified, they basically weakened the bulkhead. They created a weak spot, which was vulnerable to failure.
Oh, wow. So they made this seemingly small error years earlier, and that ended up setting the stage for what was going to happen on Flight 123.
Yeah, it was like a ticking time bomb.
It really was. So the plane is cruising towards Osaka. Everything seems normal. We're 12 minutes into the flight. And then, bam, catastrophic decompression.
That weakened bulkhead, that spot that had been compromised by that faulty repair all those years ago, it finally gave way.
What happened?
The force of the air rushing out of the pressurized cabin was incredible. The ceiling around the rear lavatories collapsed. The vertical stabilizer, that's the big fin at the tail of the plane, got ripped right off.
Oh my God.
All 4 hydraulic systems failed.
Okay, so for people who may not be super familiar with how planes work, can you just quickly explain what it means when all four hydraulic systems fail?
Sure, so hydraulic systems, they're crucial for controlling an airplane. They're used to move all those flight control surfaces, like the ailerons, the rudder, the elevator, the things that allow the pilots to steer and maneuver the plane.
Is So without
They
that,
had very minimal control of the aircraft.
so basically they were flying a giant glider at this point.
Pretty much, yeah.
Oh my God. So at this point, did the pilots have any idea what was going on?
Well, I mean, amid all this chaos, you got Captain Takahama, First Officer Sasaki, and Flight Engineer Fukuda. They were trying to do their best to assess the situation,
That's
but
been so hard to even.
they were dealing with a nightmare scenario. A jumbo jet,
Mm.
thousands of feet in the air, no control surfaces.
And they knew that the hydraulic systems were gone.
Yeah.
What did they do?
They tried something that's almost unbelievable. They attempted to regain some control using differential engine thrust.
Wait, so you're saying they tried to fly this plane using just the engines?
Yeah.
How does that even work?
Basically, they were manipulating the power of those four engines
Yeah.
individually, trying to create a sort of thrust differential
Yeah.
that would allow them to steer this massive plane.
So they had no control surfaces. And they're trying to steer this massive 747 just by using the engines.
It was a long shot.
Yeah.
It was a testament to their skill and their determination.
I can't even imagine. For how long were they able to actually keep this plane in the air?
For 32 agonizing minutes.
32 minutes. And during those 32 minutes, they were fighting against the clock. They were desperately trying to navigate this crippled 747 back towards Haneda.
Right.
Can you even imagine what that flight must have been like?
It was incredibly turbulent.
Yeah.
The plane was bucking up and down these fugoid oscillations, almost like a wild bronco.
Really?
And it was also experiencing this thing called Dutch roll, where the aircraft was rocking from side to side.
Oh my God. So it would have been like if you were driving a car on an icy road and you start to skid sideways,
Kinda, yeah.
except thousands of feet in the air.
Exactly.
And these pilots are doing everything that they can to control it.
They were, yeah.
That's just heartbreaking to think about. It's just really hard to wrap your head around what those 22 minutes must have been like for the passengers and crew. Knowing that the plane was so severely damaged that the pilots were struggling to maintain control.
Terrifying, absolutely.
Oh, yeah?
And tragically, despite their heroic efforts, the inevitable happened.
At 6:56 p.m., Japan Airlines Flight 123 crashed into a mountain ridge, Mount Takamagahara. Can you tell us a little bit about that location?
Yeah, Mount Takamagahara is in a pretty remote area, about 100 kilometers from Tokyo.
Mm-hmm.
It's rugged, mountainous, and the terrain made rescue efforts incredibly difficult.
Yeah, I can imagine. And the impact itself.
It was devastating. The plane basically hit the mountain, flipped, and then exploded. The wreckage was engulfed in flames. 520 people perished in that crash.
It's just unimaginable. But there were 4 survivors.
Yeah,
It's almost hard to believe that anyone could survive a crash like that.
it really is.
Do we know how they survived?
Well, all 4 survivors were seated in a particular section of the plane. They were on the left side towards the middle, in rows 54 to 60.
Is there any explanation as to why that particular section provided a chance of survival?
Investigators believe that the way the plane broke apart on impact, combined with the terrain, might have created a small pocket of survivable space in that area.
Wow. So it sounds like it was just sheer luck, being in the right seat at the right time.
In some ways, yes. It was a very slim margin of survival, but their stories are also, it's a testament to human resilience.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned that one of the survivors was an off-duty flight attendant, Yumi Okie.
Yes, she was found hanging upside down, still strapped into her seat.
Oh my God.
Can you imagine the strength it took to endure those hours, trapped in the wreckage, waiting for rescue?
It's incredible. And then there was also a mother and her daughter who survived.
Hiroko Yoshizaki and her 8-year-old daughter, Mikiko. It's hard to even fathom what was going through their minds, the terror, the confusion, but also the instinct to protect your child.
Yeah. And the 4th survivor.
Her name is Kaiko Kawakami. She was only 12 years old at the time.
Wow.
She lost her parents and her sister in the crash, but she survived.
I don't even have the words. It's heartbreaking and inspiring at the same time.
Definitely.
So, shifting gears a little bit, there was a lot of controversy surrounding the rescue efforts.
Right, there were reports that U.S. military aircraft in the area, they had actually spotted the crash site shortly after it happened, but they weren't able to land. And the Japanese Self-Defense Force helicopters, they couldn't land at night because of the difficult terrain and the poor visibility.
So there were delays in getting rescue crews to the crash site.
Yes, unfortunately.
And there was criticism that a faster response could have saved more lives.
That's right. It's a chilling thought that some passengers may have initially survived the crash, but then succumbed to their injuries or exposure to the elements overnight.
Yeah. It's just really hard to think about those lost hours. So while the world was grappling with this tragedy and sort of questioning those rescue efforts, investigators were working to piece together what exactly led to this crash.
Right.
What did they find?
The investigation ultimately pointed to the culprit, that faulty bulkhead repair. From 7 years prior,
Wow.
they traced that entire chain of events back to those 2 splice plates that were used instead of one continuous plate.
It's just hard to believe that a seemingly minor error made years earlier could lead to such a devastating loss of life.
It really highlights the importance of attention to detail and how crucial it is in something as complex as aviation.
Absolutely.
And the investigation actually uncovered a series of systemic failures within Japan
What do
Airlines.
you mean by systemic failures?
Well, there were things like communication breakdowns, inadequate inspection procedures, even a culture of complacency within the company.
So it wasn't just a single maintenance error. There were broader issues within the organization that contributed to this tragedy.
Yes, and the impact on Japan Airlines was huge.
Yeah.
The reputation was tarnished, there was a public outcry, and people lost trust in the airline.
Yeah, I can understand why. Yeah, it's hard to imagine the sort of ripple effect of this tragedy, both within Japan Airlines and the wider aviation industry as a whole.
Oh, it's a defining moment for sure. There were actually personnel at JL who felt such a heavy burden of responsibility
Mm.
that they tragically took their own lives.
Oh, wow.
It really underscores just how weighty this disaster was.
Yeah, it's just really sad. All the lives that were affected by this single event. So after the initial shock and the investigation, did things change within Japan Airlines?
Oh, absolutely. This crash forced the entire aviation industry to take a long, hard look at itself.
Yeah.
And within Japan Airlines, there were major overhauls in maintenance procedures, inspection protocols. It really went beyond just like checking boxes. It was a cultural shift, a renewed emphasis on safety at every single level of the organization.
Can you give me some examples of how that actually looked? What did this cultural shift mean in practice?
Sure. Well, there was a much greater focus on transparency and communication. Mechanics and engineers were encouraged to speak up if they noticed any potential safety issues, no matter how small they seemed. There was a real effort to move away from that culture of complacency and to foster a more, questioning, safety-conscious environment.
So it sounds like they were really trying to learn from the mistakes of the past and create a system where safety was the number one priority.
Exactly.
And did the impact of this tragedy extend beyond Japan Airlines?
Oh, absolutely. Flight 123 became a case study
Hmm.
for aviation safety all around the world.
Makes sense. It wasn't just a tragedy for Japan. It was like a wake-up call for the global aviation industry.
Right.
What kind of changes did we see internationally?
Well, it led to stricter regulations for aircraft maintenance, more rigorous inspection standards, and a greater emphasis on something called human factors in aviation safety.
Human factors. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, it's basically recognizing that. Pilots, mechanics, air traffic controllers, they're all human. They're going to make mistakes.
Yeah.
So there was a big push to improve training, reduce fatigue among these crucial personnel, and create systems that are more resilient to those human errors.
So, in a way, you could say that those 520 lives lost, as tragic as it was, led to changes that have made flying safer for countless others.
That's the hope. We learn from these tragedies, and we try to prevent them from happening again.
Well, as we wrap up this deep dive into the story of Japan Airlines Flight 123, what do you think is the most important takeaway for our listeners?
I think it's a reminder that sometimes even the smallest oversight can have catastrophic consequences, whether it's in aviation or any other field. Attention to detail, rigorous safety checks, and a culture that puts safety above everything else, those things are crucial.
Well said. And for everyone listening, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this. This event obviously had a huge impact on aviation safety, but it also raises all these questions about responsibility, accountability, the resilience of the human spirit. What stands out to you about this story? What lessons do you take away from it? Until next time, keep diving deep.